Hello, and welcome back to Global Perspectives in Climate Migration. My name is James K. Holder II, and today we are doing Module 5, which focuses on cyclones, hurricanes, and managed threat. Managed threat will be a new term for some of us, but we're going to work through it and even provide a case study at the end that should give a lot of context. So, what we know from the text is that these types of storms, and we're discussing tropical cyclones, hurricanes, and even typhoons act as powerful drivers and create short-term and long-term displacement. They also build recovery challenges and make rebuilding impossible in key areas. Lastly, they do create a complex effect where long-term migration is linked to an adaptation possibility or process that we're going to look at called managed retreat. Okay, so again, cyclones, hurricanes, and typhoons are essentially the same type of storm. They're categorized by sustained winds of a circular pattern or rotating storms that have winds over 74 miles per hour. So we're going to look at a couple more different categorizations of these types of storms, but basically these storms are the same, but they take on different names based on the region of the world or the country that they might be occurring in. They are known for lots of extreme rainfall, storm surges, and storm surges we know are amplified by coastal flooding and sea level rise. And then lastly, you've got the coastal flooding, which is a big part of what creates the force that drives most people from their homes and also prevents them from coming back. So managed retreat is a planned relocation of a population and also infrastructure and making sure that people are moving away from those hazard zones. So whether they're floodplains, low-lying areas, areas that have been losing like elevation and sinking. We talked about this in the previous module. Basically, the goal is risk reduction, and it is complicated by sort of the social interactions and legal dimensions around property rights, moving, people's identities linked to culture, and how people might not want to move based on their linkages to a piece of land. This is increasingly seen as a viable adaptation tool in many parts of the country and ultimately the world. So, managed retreat takes a couple of different forms, but essentially, we know that cyclones and or hurricanes are among the most devastating climate-linked events. They create devastating immediate destruction and also cascading displacement, right? So even if families are able to rebuild in those same areas, they're likely to face the exact same type of threat over time, over the same generation, right? And also, we're going to be faced with long-term erosion of whether it's infrastructure or other support systems within that community. Managed threat, as defined by your textbook, is usually a government-supported migration process that ultimately relocates people from a hazardous zone to a less hazardous zone or a zone that's considered more safe. But retreat isn't just logistical. So you have to be mindful when you think about the types of people who are subject to these types of moves, often disadvantaged communities, whether it is culturally, politically, whether it is racially. There could be different reasons why people are already sort of subject to being in a dangerous or risk-heavy zone. And when you have to move or relocate people who have generationally been subject to this type of property, there's usually like a cultural boundary or a cultural connection that is keeping people in that area. A lot of culture is tied to place. And so that is one big challenge with this method of mitigation for the threats of climate change or climate-related disasters. Now, this is a very busy visual graph. You see it is this described as the International Best Task Archive for Climate Stewardship. This is essentially a tracking of every tropical storm from the 1850s up to now, to as best as they could do this, right? So we know that there was limited ability to track storms that didn't hit the land or hit landfall in these areas, but as they did, they were tracked in this diagram here. See, now this is all over the world. You can kind of see North America here. You can see where storms are coming off of that sort of west coast of Africa and driving more towards what is the Gulf Coast under this large collection of vectors here. So I'm trying to zoom this out a little bit. Okay. And if you see here, there's two things I want to show you. There's a legend here that describes the speed categories and like what defines them. Okay. So you've got categories. You've essentially got like a tropical depression, lowest level, tropical storm. Neither of these rise to the occasion of being called a cyclone or a hurricane because they are below that 74 mile per hour mark, right? But then you have 5 categorizations of hurricanes, which range anywhere from 74 miles per hour to 95 miles per hour, going all the way up to Category 5, which is any storm with 155 mile per hour winds or higher. And as of now, that is the highest categorization of storms. So that is the Saffir-Simpson hurricane wind scale. So again, you're seeing that these types of storms really impact a majority of the globe. The global south, the global north are both impacted here. And today we're going to really focus on more of the global north and try to get a really good understanding of some of the things that have happened right here in the United States. Okay, let's talk briefly about how storms drive displacement. So we know that evacuations are a big part of storms. People get early onset warnings, people get notifications that weather is coming in, and that may or may not cause certain people to migrate. This is a big part of what we're studying in our group, right? So those evacuations ultimately lead to long-term displacements. And why is that? It could be a part of the fact that there's nowhere to return. If you leave and your house is underwater or your community is flooded or there's no infrastructure or power, the bridges are out. If there's lots of devastation in your area, you might not have a means of returning immediately, at least. So there's going to be some level of long-term displacement with almost any storm. And the short-term evacuation is a driver of that. And one thing we also notice is that low-income communities tend to see a much slower redevelopment of their communities. So if an area that was already underserved is now blighted by a storm or a lot of severe flooding, then more likely than not, they might be last to be cleaned up or repaired or made safe, if at all. And we see this time and time again. Lastly, it's kind of what we talked about last time. We mentioned this in the last module, where you often have the repeated nature of these types of storms and fears associated with going through the same type of thing that might prevent people from moving back at all. So ultimately, those are a lot of the drivers that lead people to permanently relocate or flee. Pictured here is a community called Ile de Jean Charles. It is in Louisiana. It's on the Gulf Coast. And so we're going to talk about this community in a while. But one thing you notice is it's completely surrounded by water. We'll get into a bit of why that is and what's happening there. But when we talk about vulnerability plus the exposure, again, this is bringing back that risk factor. Understanding that this place is a prime zone or target for high risk when it comes to being devastated by a storm. So urbanization concentrates people in low-lying coastal zones, and we've seen this in other parts of the globe, right? Weak housing and degraded wetlands and loss of natural buffers increases flood risk. So as we see that sinking of the land over time, we haven't talked about this much, but it is in a lot of the text. The challenge is faced by insurance. When insurance is not able or willing to front the risk for these places, it might mean that insurance becomes unaffordable, or it could also make so that insurance becomes increasingly defaulted, like they just don't pay on those policies when things happen. And we're seeing that all over the country actually now. Similarly, when recovery aid does come, whether it's through FEMA or other federal grants, it oftentimes is that same sort of trickle down effect where it like starts at the top. It starts at the more wealthy, established communities. Those who have like the political power and influence might get funding first to repair their areas, and then it ultimately trickles down to lower income or those communities that were at the most risk to begin with. And then lastly, we see this phenomenon of pre-existing vulnerabilities as people choose to rebuild in place. So again, that decision to stay, even though we know we're facing repeated threats of the land sinking a little bit, and then also rising sea levels, and also increased storm surges and increased frequency of storms themselves. Government, as always, plays a major role in how these things unravel. Our big case study for today revolves primarily around Louisiana, neighboring states within the Gulf Coast region, as they pertain to Hurricane Katrina, which was a massive storm in 2005. Now, I'm sure you have heard of Hurricane Katrina. Today is going to be primarily focused on that event. So I do want to let you know you should expect there's going to be it's a challenging topic. It is a very sensitive topic in American history, even now. Later we'll call you to watch a video that might be a little challenging as well, but it's a 60 minutes news reporting that ultimately can be very emotional and triggering. So I want you all to engage in the topic and understand what the sense was at that time, but we're going to jump right in. So in this headline, we're seeing a newspaper describe that buses are taking evacuees out of New Orleans 5 days after the storm and the flooding has already hit. We're seeing there was a lack of preparation. We're seeing there was a lack of federal support. We're seeing there was a lack of a local authority. And I want to kind of go through some of these examples and how they pertain to the US, but also how this type of issue, we've seen it overlap in other parts of the world as well. So disaster recovery depends on state capacity and also coordination. So if there's not, for instance, a lot of coordination between your local government and your state government, let's say at the governor's mansion, if there are political divisions between those two bodies, there might be challenges in getting support to a city. Corruption, of course, plays a role, but poor zoning and sort of different ambiguities within jurisdiction, not knowing who's responsible for what, could be a challenge. In our country, in many states, we have different types of jurisdictions that overlap. So you might have a city, and you might also have a county. Some places are states, and some are commonwealths, and some are. There's a lot of different ways how different things connect, and based on proximity, they might overlap or may not overlap. And when that happens, there might be challenges in determining who's responsible, who should take priority, et cetera, et cetera. Relocation efforts might lack community participation. People, again, might be reluctant to move for a number of reasons we've seen before. It could have to do with employment. It could have to do with perceived discontinuity of healthcare. It could have to do with a number of reasons why people might not want to move. And essentially, what we have seen in Hurricane Katrina at that time is the natural disaster or extreme weather event cascading into a massive social crisis. Um, Now, you can see by just the sheer scale of this storm. This is, of course, Doppler radar from 2005, from before, well, as the storm is hitting the coast. You can see under here where this big, I'm kind of like zooming in on it. That is New Orleans, essentially. That is Louisiana and that, that part of the Gulf Coast. So this storm is heading directly for this city. And essentially, they were not prepared. Hurricane Katrina remains the defining moment in U.S. climate migration. Over 1.5 million people were displaced, making it the largest internal migration in U.S. history. Okay, now let's talk about the storm and its impacts. This was a Category 5 storm. Keep that in mind, because when you watch the video later, they're going to discuss what provisions were in place and what level they were prepared to sustain. 1.5 million people displaced. Levee failures accounted for 80% of the city of New Orleans flooding. And the levees themselves essentially were only engineered to prevent a Category 3 storm winds. Like that would, but this was Category 5, so it was significantly higher, significantly more powerful. The displacement disproportionately, of course, impacted who it always disproportionately impacts, which is Black and low-income residents of the city of New Orleans. And then lastly, even with the permanent population loss of the city, you still see highlights of like discrepancies and sort of racial lines and poverty and political failures here. Okay? So, the recovery was also not great. It was not seen as positive or very well organized. Okay? So, it was uneven. Places like the Lower Ninth Ward, which I've spoken with you all about directly, saw the lowest return rates. And a lot of that was because there was no infrastructure in those communities. There was no streetlights. The roads were not really adequately put back together. The levees that had been damaged were not really adequately prepared to sustain something else. So there wasn't really a place to return. And frankly, all of New Orleans saw a very slow return. Like the buildup was very slow. But I want you all to just kind of keep your eyes peeled for like some things that will come up in the rest of this lecture. What happened that created a big problem is that a lot of the federal funding that went to restore New Orleans focused on infrastructure. There were a lot of failures that really involved places outside of the state of New Orleans. In fact, there was a massive gas pipeline that failed during the storm, and it shot gas prices in the southeast up. I mean, I think as I remember it, that was the first time I ever saw gas over $5 a gallon in Atlanta. So that was like a massive shock to the system. And of course, things like that come back. But as things were unfolding, what you'll notice is those bigger infrastructure pieces, whether it's like massive bridges or roads, interstates, those types of things tend to get patched up first. And then when it comes down to like the low-lying communities that were, at risk in the first place, they're not really getting that same level of priority. So for our second part of the case study, that was Hurricane Katrina. And we're going to see in the video, the video that we're going to see after this, or you're going to link to after this, you'll see a little bit more about Hurricane Katrina. Like I was saying before, Ile de Jean-Charles, in Louisiana is an island community, but it is connected by roadways. And basically, decades of erosion by repeated hurricanes has ultimately made the island uninhabitable. But people still were not really willing or excited about moving for a number of reasons. I think there's some level of sovereignty that you have in your community and in your physical land that people didn't want to necessarily give up very readily. Okay, so let's discuss the case for retreat. And this is really, really telling as to why this place was chosen. Number one, there's indigenous populations there, which are tied to lots of long-standing history and politics and policy and also finances and class issues as well that also contribute to that sort of sense of self attached to sense of place, making so that people don't want to necessarily relocate. And this number here is so incredible. A loss of 98% of land from this island from 1950. And this is due to subsidence, which is the slowly like sinking of land, and also the sea level rise. They received a $48 million housing and urban development grant for basically to relocate the island, or we're talking this managed retreat. And so there was cultural resistance, and this is actually the first managed retreat that's funded in the United States, like that's federally funded in the United States. So it's really interesting, like, to see this as an approach and why why this area was chosen, how it's going along, how might this be a case study that shows future implications of not just managed retreat in the United States, but just globally. How can this be done, and how can this work to save lives? So the potential challenges were always just that even though this is proactive, it is just as much social as it is environmental. So we have to factor in trust. Do people believe that they're going to end up with less? And again, it goes back to the same things we talked about before with flooding. We talked about just that feeling of what's going to happen if I leave, if I can't come back, or am I going to have the same access to the same thing? So that trust factor is massive, and also a belonging factor. The success of any retreat depends on whether communities help define the process. So again, having that integrated process where members of the community are engaged and as a part of the solution, and not just being told where to go and what to do. Retreat in this case is not failure, it is adaptation. It is also important that we have to balance safety with cultural continuity and justice. This requires long-term financial support, usually from federal sources, and the success depends on linking relocation to broader resilience strategies. So again, just making sure that if someone is relocating, they're not moving into the same scenario. It's not going to become the same issue or a different issue or a worse issue later on. Now, here's there is a next step with this. Instead of pointing to the next lecture, which would be Module 6, I want you all to look at this video on YouTube. The name of the video is Our First Report on Hurricane Katrina, and it's from the 60 Minutes archive. It's actual news footage and interviews from that time. So I really wanted everyone to take a look at this because it's, we've seen countless documentaries come out as a result of what happened. And it's, hindsight is always 20/20, right? But seeing the culture, seeing the reaction, seeing the anguish, the fear that happened then, I think really will help speak to the culture and the process of decision making as potential evacuees that we're exploring in our research group. So thank you for tuning in, and make sure you check out the next video. I'll link it below. Thanks.